My husband swore the child was his, unaware I had DINA results for 3 years. Renee Voss was 38 years old the afternoon her husband stood in the living room of their Nashville home with his hand on his chest and swore to his mother, to his brother, and to every person seated at that table that the child was his, that he had no doubt, and that anyone who suggested otherwise was a liar and would be treated as one. He said it with the force of a man who had rehearsed it, which Renee recognized because she had spent 11 years listening to the specific register that his voice reached when he was performing conviction rather than feeling it. She drove a 7-year-old sedan. She wore the same 3 work cardigans on rotation. Her name appeared on nothing that impressed people at first glance, and she had arranged it that way deliberately, because her grandfather had taught her, before she could drive, that the most dangerous thing a woman could do was show her cards to someone still deciding how to play the game. What her husband Lionel did not know, what he had not thought to look for in 8 years of marriage, was that she had held a certified DINA report in a locked drawer of her home office for 37 months, and that across those same 37 months she had restructured, reclassified, and quietly consolidated every financial interest she held, including a legal practice that billed $900,000 a year and had never legally belonged to him for a single day of their marriage, into a form that no divorce proceeding he could afford to initiate would be able to touch. He believed he was the one holding leverage. He had no idea what she had been building while he performed. What happened when the mediation documents landed on that conference table would cost him everything he thought that child had secured for him. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The late afternoon light came through the kitchen window of the house on Whitfield Lane in the particular gold that only arrived in October in Nashville, landing across the butcher block counter in a wide warm band and making the whole kitchen look like something out of a photograph. Renee stood at the counter with a paring knife in her hand and a bowl of apples in front of her, peeling them in the long, continuous spiral her grandfather had shown her when she was 7 years old, the blade moving with a patience that was both skill and temperament. She had installed this counter herself, not because the original laminate had failed, but because she had found the butcher block at an estate sale in Brentwood for $400 and had spent 2 Saturdays measuring, cutting, and fitting it into place until the seams were flush and the finish was sealed correctly. She ran her hand along it most mornings the way you run your hand along something you built and trust. Her grandfather, Thomas Voss, had been a master electrician and a man of almost theatrical economy with words. He had raised Renee and her younger sister from the time she was 11, after their mother's illness took her quickly and her father found he was not built for the weight of it. Thomas had not compensated for this loss by speaking more than he needed to. He had compensated by being entirely reliable, and he had passed that down to Renee the way certain things pass between people without being said, through example, through repetition, through the shape of a life observed closely across many years. He had told her once, when she was preparing for the bar exam and afraid in the way that competent people are afraid before large tests, that a woman who knows what she knows does not need anyone to confirm it. She had carried that into every courtroom she had ever entered. Renee was an attorney, business litigation, primarily, with a client base she had built over 12 years from nothing into a practice that billed just under $900,000 a year, housed in a small office on Church Street in downtown Nashville with 4 associates, and a reputation built entirely on outcomes rather than visibility. She did not advertise. She did not network loudly. She let the work move the way her grandfather had always let his work move, on the strength of itself, without announcement. Only her accountant and her office manager held the full financial picture. Lionel believed her practice was modest because she drove a modest car and wore modest clothes and spoke about her work with a modesty he had never once thought to look past. He had never asked to see her tax returns. She had met Lionel Voss at a law school alumni gathering 6 years before they married, when she was 30 and he was 32, and charming in the way of men who have learned to read rooms and adjust accordingly. He had been warm and curious and had asked her about her cases rather than her firm, which told her he was either genuinely interested or smart enough to perform interest convincingly. She had noticed that distinction and filed it, and decided that warmth, even performed warmth, was a reasonable starting point. He was in commercial development, dealt in numbers that impressed people at tables, and treated her family, particularly her grandfather, who had met him twice and said very little, with consistent respect. They married in the spring of the year she turned 32. Her grandfather gave a toast of 3 sentences that landed harder than most toasts, twice as long. She had no idea she had married a man who was already measuring the distance between who she was and what he thought he was owed. The first signal she did not name came during the 2nd year of marriage. A receipt in the pocket of a jacket she was taking to the dry cleaner for a restaurant on the east side of town on a Wednesday evening when Lionel had told her he was in Knoxville for a site meeting. She placed it on the kitchen counter and looked at it for a moment, and then she placed it in the small ceramic bowl by the door where she kept things that needed attention, and she went about her evening. She was a litigator. She understood that a single exhibit proved nothing. A pattern of exhibits proved everything. She began paying careful attention. The discovery happened not through argument or accusation, but through a lab report. In the spring of the 3rd year of their marriage, Renee had a miscarriage at 11 weeks. A quiet and private grief she managed with the same composure she managed most difficult things, by moving through it rather than around it. During the medical follow-up, her doctor had noted some routine blood work findings that led to an incidental genetic panel. Among the results was a blood type confirmation that gave Renee a piece of information she sat with for 3 full days before she understood its implication. She had done her own research, carefully and without urgency, the way she prepared for any evidentiary question she expected to encounter. She ordered a private DNA collection kit through a medical laboratory her firm had used for expert witness sourcing. She collected what she needed from Lionel without his awareness, from a hairbrush in their shared bathroom on a Tuesday morning while he was in the shower. She mailed the samples the same afternoon. She went to work. She argued a deposition. She came home and made dinner and asked Lionel about his day and listened to the answer and said nothing else. The results arrived on a Thursday, 12 days later, in a sealed envelope addressed to her private post office box on Church Street. She opened it at her office desk with her door closed. Her hands did not shake. The results were unambiguous. The language of a DNA report does not accommodate uncertainty when certainty is present. She read it twice, folded it along its original crease, placed it in a new envelope, and locked it in the bottom drawer of her desk. She sat for a long time with her hands flat on the desk, and the afternoon light coming through the office window, and the sound of Church Street moving below her, entirely indifferent to what had just been confirmed. She was not surprised. That was the part that told her most about what she had known and had not yet named. She moved with the same deliberate calm that had always defined her at the moments in a courtroom when the other side did not yet understand that the case had turned. She opened her laptop. She opened a blank document. She titled it, with the precise legal habit of a woman who spent her days naming things carefully, with a single phrase, contingency file. And then she began to work. Over the following weeks and then months, she did not confront Lionel. She did not alter her behavior in any way that would signal a change in what he believed. She was present at dinner. She asked about his projects. She listened with the full and attentive patience she had always brought to him, which he received as warmth, and which was in fact the disciplined stillness of a woman who had decided that the time for the truth was not yet, and that nothing would be gained by moving before the work was finished. She attended 2 of his family events and was warm and gracious in the way she had always been. She continued, on the surface, to be the woman he had married, quiet, modest, professionally busy, unremarkable in the ways that he had always found reassuring. He was performing certainty for an audience that had stopped believing the performance 3 years ago. Below the surface, she was doing the most thorough work of her professional life. She spent the first 6 months with her accountant, a woman named Sylvia Odom, who had managed Renee's practice finances since the 2nd year of operation, restructuring the manner in which the practice's assets were held. Nothing fraudulent. Nothing hidden in the way that would not survive a forensic audit, but everything arranged with the legal precision of a litigator who understood exactly how marital asset classification worked in Tennessee, and who had been careful, since before the marriage, to keep the practice legally distinct. Sylvia reviewed every change with the focus of a woman who had seen enough matrimonial financial disputes to understand what the endgame of this kind of restructuring looked like, and she did not ask questions that were not hers to ask. She did the work. She kept the records. The practice itself grew during those 3 years, not because Renee had engineered its growth for strategic purposes, but because she had always worked at the pace of someone who had nothing to prove and therefore nothing to slow her down. By the time she was ready, the practice was billing just under $900,000 annually, entirely protected by its premarital incorporation structure and the operational separation she had maintained throughout the marriage. Some things you build, some things you simply do not allow to be taken. 12 months into the contingency file, she visited her grandfather. Thomas Voss was 79 years old and lived in the same house in East Nashville where he had raised Renee and her sister, and he was one of the few people who had always seen her completely, without the filter of what she appeared to be. He had not been told the details of what was happening in her marriage. She had not needed to tell him. He had asked her the previous Christmas how things were, and she had said fine, and he had looked at her with the long reading look of a man who had spent decades diagnosing problems in electrical systems and had learned that the wiring was usually the last thing people thought to check. She sat at his kitchen table on a Saturday afternoon and told him everything. He listened with his hands folded and his eyes on the table and did not interrupt once. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. He said, "When I was starting out, there was an old electrician who told me that the way to know if a circuit is safe is not to look at it. It's to document every connection before you close the wall. What you can prove is what holds. What you assume will always let you down." She looked at her grandfather's hands across the table and felt the truth of it settle into her the way things settle when they confirm what you already knew. In the 18th month of the contingency file, Renee retained a licensed private investigator named Curtis Webb, who had been recommended by a colleague she trusted and who came with a reputation for discretion that was, she had verified, accurately earned. She gave him what she had already documented and asked him to complete the picture. He worked for 6 weeks. What he produced was thorough in the way that only a person trained to look without being seen can produce thorough work. The shell entity registered in a name she had not recognized turned out to be a single-member LLC incorporated in the 2nd year of their marriage. Its registered address was the Germantown condominium. Its operating account had received 41 deposits over 26 months, drawn from a personal account Lionel had opened at a different institution from their joint banking, in increments of $800 to $2,000 per deposit, totaling $31,400. Dara Sims had been added to the lease in the 9th month. The investigator had photographs. He had dates. He had receipts. He had the kind of documentation that a litigator recognized immediately as the kind that does not require interpretation because it does not leave room for any. Renee added the investigator's report to the contingency file. The file was now 62 pages. She drove home that evening and stopped at the office on Church Street. She unlocked the bottom drawer. She took the DINA envelope from its 3 years of careful company and placed it at the front of the contingency file, which was organized by category, indexed, and duplicated on a drive that lived in Sylvia's office safe. She made one phone call from the parking lot to Felicia Grant, a family law attorney she had referred clients to for 8 years and trusted with the same conviction she trusted her own work. She said, "I'm ready. Let's begin." Preparation is the only honest form of patience. The mediation took place on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after Renee had filed, in a conference room at Felicia Grant's firm in Midtown Nashville. Neutral-toned walls, a long oval table, chairs with no particular comfort. Lionel arrived with his attorney, a man who specialized in high-asset divorce proceedings and who had presumably been told, as Lionel had presumably believed, that the primary contested asset was the legal practice and that the practice's valuation would be the pivot of the proceeding. He had no idea what was in the second binder. Renee sat beside Felicia at one side of the table. She wore the same kind of cardigan she had always worn. She had not changed anything about how she presented herself in this room, and that was a choice. Felicia opened the first binder. She walked through the practice structure, the incorporation date, predating the marriage by 4 years, the operational accounts, the billing history, the legal structure under Tennessee law that classified it unambiguously as a separate asset. Lionel's attorney reviewed it with the expression of a man encountering a wall he had not been told was there. He spoke quietly to Lionel. Lionel's jaw tightened, but he held his composure. He had been expecting this fight, and he believed he had arguments. Then Felicia opened the second binder. She set the DINA report on the table first, the certified laboratory letterhead, the collection date, the result stated in the language of molecular certainty, which left no interpretive room. She said nothing about it beyond setting it in front of him. Then she set down a timeline, 37 months, charted by date, documenting the parallel financial and personal activity that Renee's investigation, conducted through a licensed investigator retained in the 18th month of the contingency file, had compiled. Hotel receipts, a lease on a condominium in Germantown, paid for through a business account Lionel had opened in a name Renee had not recognized until Sylvia identified it as a shell entity registered to a woman named Dara Sims, a sales director at a firm Lionel's company contracted with, whose financial records showed a pattern of deposits that corresponded precisely with the dates of the withdrawals from a personal account Lionel had maintained outside their joint banking. He had been conducting a parallel life for 31 months. He had told people publicly, including at the table in his family's living room, that the child was his. The DINA report said otherwise. Lionel looked at the report. He looked at the timeline. He looked at Renee for the first time since sitting down, and what crossed his face in that moment was the specific arithmetic of a man realizing how long he had been operating on assumptions that had never been tested, and what it cost when the testing finally arrived. He said her name. He said it differently than he had said it in the living room that day. Quieter, without the performance. He said he could explain. He said she didn't have the whole picture. He said there were things she didn't understand about the pressures he had been under, about what had driven him to certain decisions, and that if she would just let him, Felicia Grant said, evenly and without volume, the filing is complete. The documentation is in order. There is nothing left to explain. Lionel looked at his attorney. His attorney looked at the table. Renee straightened the edge of the binder in front of her with one hand, the small and deliberate gesture of a woman tidying the conclusion of a case she had been building for a very long time and had always known would end exactly here. She looked at Lionel without anger, without theater, with a clear, even focus of someone who had spent 3 years building toward a moment and found it exactly as she had prepared for. You spent 8 years looking at me, she said, and you saw what you needed me to be. I spent 3 years looking at the facts. The difference between us is that I documented mine. She stood. She picked up her bag. She walked out of the conference room and did not look back at the room she was leaving. The work was done. It had been done for a long time. She had simply waited until the right morning to show it to the people who needed to see it, which was the most efficient thing she had ever done with patience in her life. 5 months passed the way they do when you are no longer maintaining a performance. Quickly, without the weight of it, forward, Renee stood in the kitchen of the house on Whitfield Lane on a Saturday morning in March, her hands in flour pressing biscuit dough against the butcher block counter she had installed herself 4 years ago, and still ran her hand along most mornings because it remained exactly as she had built it. She had bought Lionel out of his equity interest in the house through the mediation agreement, which Felicia had structured with the precision that the documentation demanded, and the house was hers now in the clean and total way that things are yours when no one else has a claim on them. The practice had taken on 2 new clients in the months since the filing, referrals from Felicia's network, and Sylvia had revised the annual billing projection upward for the first time in 2 years, $940,000. The number was not what mattered. What mattered was that it was accurate, and that it was hers. A man named Andre Whitmore had started appearing at the edges of her life in the easy and unannounced way that good things sometimes arrive. He was a physician she had met at a community board meeting she attended in her grandfather's neighborhood, where Thomas Voss had lived for 50 years and where a new health clinic was being proposed. Andre had presented the clinic's case to the board with the calm competence of a man who understood his subject and did not need to perform authority to communicate it. He had found Renee afterward and asked if she knew a good construction attorney because the clinic needed one. She had given him 2 names and he had said thank you and then said that he hoped she didn't mind if he reached out again, and she had said she did not mind. He was not loud. He was not performing. He showed up when he said he would, which remained, in her experience, the single most reliable signal of character. She heard about Lionel the way she heard about things that were no longer her concern, in passing, through people who mentioned it without knowing how little she needed it. The development firm had restructured after several investors pulled out following a background review that surfaced the shell entity and the financial discrepancies that Renee's investigator had first identified. He was consulting now independently at a rate considerably below what he had earned before. Tara Sims had relocated. His brother, the same one who had sat at that living room table and heard Lionel swear his oath with conviction, had not spoken to him since the mediation documents became part of the public record. Renee cut the biscuits with the rim of a glass, the way her grandfather had always cut them, pressing straight down without twisting, because he had told her that twisting sealed the edges and kept them from rising right. She placed them on the pan in 2 even rows and slid the pan into the oven and set the timer with the same unhurried precision she brought to everything that was worth doing correctly. Through the kitchen window, the March light was thin and clean and coming in at an angle that would deepen into gold by afternoon. Her grandfather was coming for lunch. Her sister was bringing the children. The house would be full in the particular way that a house that has been freed of the weight of performance becomes full, easily, without effort, in the way of things that have finally settled into their correct shape. She washed the flour from her hands at the sink and dried them on the kitchen towel and stood for a moment in the quiet. A woman who knows what she knows does not need anyone to confirm it. Her grandfather had said that. He had been right about that, as he was right about most things that endured. She was free. She was whole. She was done waiting for anyone to catch up to what she had already known. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.